Thanks for joining us here on 90s Plus. I'm Chris Beyond. So on Thursday, July 6th, a new social media app launching as a direct challenge to Twitter. Threads is being launched by Facebook's parent company, Meta, you've probably heard of it, as a thought or blog streaming service that's similar to Elon Musk's now Twitter. Some experts say that Threads could be a, quote, Twitter killer. What does social media look like after Threads launches, and what other social media companies could take some of the space that's been maybe relinquished a little bit by Twitter? So for a bit more about this, we're now joined by Luke Lintz, who is the CEO at High Key Enterprises, which is a digital and social media company. And so, Luke, thanks for taking the time to join us here on 90s Plus and lending us some of your expertise here.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, Chris. Really looking forward to talking about Threads.
Yeah, so first of all, what's your understanding, maybe focusing on Threads a little bit, what's your understanding about how Threads will work and how it might look like in comparison to Twitter?
Yeah, from what's been released so far in terms of the mock-ups of Threads is that it looks like it's pretty much an exact replica of Twitter in terms of the user interface. And I think the main differentiating factor is that it's backed by a total social media conglomerate of Meta, where if you take the user base of Instagram and Facebook, which is owned by Meta, it's drastically bigger than the current Twitter user base. And so extrapolating that in terms of having it as a catapult launch of when Threads launches tomorrow, I think it's going to be absolutely massive in terms of the numbers and user base it's going to bring in.
So sounds like you think it'll be successful. Maybe compare it to, there's some pretty decent challenges right now to Twitter, Blue Sky, Post, Mastodon. Why do you think, is it because of the Facebook Meta backing that may give Threads better chances of succeeding?
Yeah, I think the Meta backing is the biggest component that gives Threads the most competitive advantage in terms of competing with Twitter compared to like a lot of those other platforms like Truth Social. A lot of those other platforms are appealing to a very niche audience I've seen, where like if you look at Truth Social, it's appealing to a very conservative audience, and conservative audience are like appealing to a specific political spectrum is never good for a social media platform because it doesn't take into the components of virality of a social media platform, which is getting people to argue and actually disagree, which creates virality and controversy on social media. And that's what's been allowed to happen on other social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter.
That's super interesting. So maybe one thought that I've got here, Luke, and kind of delving into maybe the political aspect, because I think there is one here. Could social media become politically fractured? And I say that because Elon Musk has advocated for a lot of pretty conservative causes on Twitter, and he's got a lot of right-leaning support on Twitter. Anecdotally, it seems like a lot of people who are verified now, who pay for that $8 a month verification, tend to lean right-wing. I think that's not a particularly controversial thing to say. So I see that. Can we see Threads perhaps become essentially a left-leaning social media site, and Twitter a right-leaning one? How could that work?
Well, 100%. And it kind of alludes to what you were talking about beforehand, where basically if Threads does actually successfully take over market ownership of Twitter, then it kind of has a monopoly over the social media space, where like they have competitors in terms of every space of social media. Like, for example, they have IG Reels to compete with TikTok. They had IG Stories that took over the market of Snapchat, a large market share there. Threads taking over Twitter, a large component of that. And then getting back to your question in terms of being kind of like the political side of things, it's actually very interesting that Threads is actually not launching in the EU. And it's probably because they got slapped with a $1.4 billion lawsuit. I'm not sure if it was a crazy, it was one of like the biggest lawsuits in GDPR history, where EU basically billed them for just infringement on the GDPR rights, which is just crazy. And I think we're going to see a lot more like that.
Very interesting. Well, I guess going back to Twitter, Elon Musk took over Twitter back in 2022. He slashed staff to try and cut costs. He's removed verifications. We've talked about the legacy users. And he also recently introduced a limit on the amount of tweets that one can seat per day, which has been quite controversial. What do you make of his stewardship of Twitter so far?
I think Elon came into Twitter at definitely not the best time. I personally think that Twitter was on a downward spiral either way, trying to compete with other social media platforms, even though it had complete market dominance in its specific area. So even though it's always been extremely small compared to the other very large social media applications like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, compared to user base size, it had complete dominance in terms of the short form blogging space. There wasn't really any competitor of just short form brand content primarily on a social media platform. And so Threads is like a direct competitor to that, being launched with the backbone of it. And so in terms of what Elon has done with it, I think he's doing the best that he absolutely can. He's moving it to a private. He's already moved it to a private company, delisted off of the public exchange, and so like funding is going to be strapped. He's having to constantly cut costs and try and increase revenues, which is why he's doing such a hard push for Twitter Blue. And I personally think that it might be a controversial opinion, but I think that Elon Musk is going to actually turn Twitter into a decentralized social media network, which could potentially be either extremely good or extremely bad for Twitter as a whole.
What would that mean if it's a decentralized social media platform? What does that mean to the average user?
Yeah, so what that means is that it would basically, so right now, social media platforms, like for example, like Threads, Instagram, and Facebook are all owned by Meta. And so all data, all cookies, all basically everything is stored by the company Meta. Same with Twitter right now, even though it's delisted from public exchanges, it's still all of the data is stored by the company Twitter and isn't shared with anybody. And so if it becomes a decentralized social media network, it would go onto a blockchain where basically it's shared on a peer-to-peer network where everybody would have access to the open source data of Twitter, open source, just everything. The capabilities of advertising would be spread across everybody. It's very interesting. It gets into a very convoluted topic, but yeah, I really think that decentralized social media is like where things are heading, and we'll see it more with like Meta having a complete monopoly over social media platforms where you get into some really dangerous stuff when if one person owns all of the social media networks that controls all of the audience and controls all of the attention that people have.
Yeah, let's walk down that rabbit hole a little bit here, Luke, and say that Mark Zuckerberg, and let's say that Threads is successful, and Meta would control Instagram, Facebook, and Threads, as you talked about here, and that social media monopoly. What does that look like, again, maybe to the average user?
Yeah, I don't think it would be seen immediately. It would happen over time, but just think things that Meta has done in the past has basically shown that they're definitely more of a left-leaning company as a whole. And certain things that they've done have been very controversial to a lot of people in terms of completely banning accounts that spoke anything against like COVID-19 or the pandemic, and completely banning them and deleting them forever. And you see this a lot with Meta and other social media platforms where creators spend so much time and so much of their life building up their social media platforms, thinking that they actually own their social media profiles and own the accounts that they're building up and spending like their entire life into. And at any point, the company behind that, Meta, can delete that account if they speak up against something that Meta doesn't believe in. In in theory, basically. And so what that could mean is basically Meta pushing their specific views on a mass scale across the entire user base, which is basically the content that's being put out on every day, and controlling and monitoring the content that goes out every single day.
Well, I suppose that's a big challenge here, and kind of the increasing age of disinformation. I suppose that's kind of maybe a topic for another day here. I guess because yeah, that's obviously quite the big broad perspective. I guess maybe even stepping back further, and let's again, this is going down a hypothetical path that Threads is successful, as it seems like you think it will be, Luke. And from a broad social media perspective, what does the overarching landscape look like in a world where Threads basically takes out Twitter? Twitter is kind of even more niche than it is now, and Facebook, Instagram are dominant. What does that look like from a broad perspective? Admittedly, a very broad question.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of the like future pacing, when Threads does take over, I don't see a scenario where Threads doesn't take over. Like
Hmm.
with upon Threads launch, they explained how your username will be transferred over from Instagram, so you'll be using the same username, and they even hinted towards that your following will be transferred over from Instagram, which is something I personally like. Like I have over 1 million followers on Instagram, so if those followers get translated to Threads, I'm for sure going to be using Threads a ton on
Mhm.
that platform. And so in terms of like what I see if that happens is I don't see a major change for like the average person of what things look like. I see actually more people getting into Threads that weren't even a part of Twitter, like me, where I was never a massive user of Twitter. But if Threads does everything that they say they are going to be, I'm going to be a user of Threads, just because I primarily use Instagram and stuff. And so I think Twitter has always been this very niche platform for a very specific user base, where there were some statistics that the average Twitter user only uses Twitter and does not use other social media platforms, where there was other statistics that the average user of like Instagram or TikTok uses all social media platforms. And so it was
Hmm.
interesting to see that differentiation where like Twitter is like a very isolated community. And so if that takes it over, it's going to be, yeah, very interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, I think Twitter, I mean, you would know better than I would, but Twitter has been used for a lot of real time information, for news, for sports, for instant reactions. I think that's where Twitter has thrived. But I suppose with some of the rate limiting that you've seen and Elon Musk's pretty direct, as you mentioned, overtures to try and get people on Twitter Blue, and that's probably scared away quite a few people. Do you see Threads taking over that landscape of those kind of instantaneous, journalists reporting news, meteorologists reporting weather, public agencies delivering critical, perhaps life-saving information? Is that space could be taken over here by Threads? Do you think?
Yeah, I feel like a component of it will. And I don't see this as like an overnight shift of
Mhm.
where Threads comes out and then magically every single Twitter user just stops using Twitter and then goes to Threads. It's going to be a shift where I think the people who are using the majority of daily active users of Twitter will be staying on Twitter and might test the waters over on Threads. I think Threads primarily is going to be bringing on a new user base, people who are currently using Instagram and aren't primarily using Twitter, and going on to Threads and using that as their new short form content, and where they are absorbing basically news that's coming out. And then gradually over time, I think it'll take market ownership over Twitter.
Fascinating. I suppose, is there anything else about this Threads launch and the social media landscape that we haven't covered that you think warrants more attention?
Yeah, well, I think this entire play of Meta launching this is like I see it as extremely smart in terms of them launching it at the perfect time. Like everything in our current world for Gen Z and millennials are going into the era of short form content.
Hmm.
And Instagram has primarily worked on taking over the short form video content landscape with IG stories, IG reels, and everything has been geared toward 2023 has really been the year of short form video content. And there really hasn't been the short form RIN content, which is definitely needed in this world. And Twitter has been that only thing there. And so I think Threads is going to draw the gap there, take it over. And I think it's going to be really cool to see.
Fascinating. Well, seems like some fast times ahead for social media, and especially in the short form content world. Luke Lintz, CEO at High Key Enterprises, a digital and social media company. Thanks for joining us with a few minutes of your time and lending us your expertise about this here today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Appreciate it.